Welcome to the ThinApp Bootcamp series, Implementation Best Practices. My name is Ray Dusseault, Senior Consultant, End User Computing Center of Excellence, Global Strategy and Enablement. Today's agenda, we're going to be looking at strategic initiatives that have come up over the coming months. We're going to be looking at implementation best practices and a summary at the end. Strategic initiatives. Over the last few months, ThinApp scalability and performance testing has come front and center now that ThinApp is actually looked at as the, one of the top enterprise application virtualization solutions. So we need to address those concepts front and center. This led to the concept known as ThinApp Streaming Lifecycle. There's also an initiative around the ThinApp administration utility for View. We'll get into that shortly. ThinApp scalability and performance has come to the forefront as one of the top challenges or demands from customers. There's really two key areas of investigation: network that surrounds ThinApp Streaming, and disk, which is still evolving. My goal is to involve NetApp and EMC and their ThinApp repository best practices in the form of guides. I really feel that it's important to have those types of guides be on their paper. I believe it'll be a lot more plausible and from a customer perspective. If we were to write them, it might look odd. So that's why it still is listed as coming soon. So we are currently working with them to create those guides and best practices. In the meantime, we are focused on the network piece, which is ThinApp Streaming, and to attempt to clear up some of the misconceptions around ThinApp Streaming and the generalities of that basic concept. So our approach, step one, establish a framework. We have done that. Step two, verify methodology. We've done that. We've tested this with a number of large enterprises, and we've communicated it through various forums as far as VMworld and Partner Exchange. So we're pretty excited about the methodology. At this point, we're in the testing phase, so we are trying to create the testing guideline on site with large customers along with the Lighthouse program. So what it comes down to is some concepts: the ThinApp Streaming workload, the traffic consumed by the application during the launch process. This can also be considered the first launch of the ThinApp package. But as I said, there's been a lot of generalities around what ThinApp Streaming is. For a long time, the basic premise was, yep, you create a shortcut to a ThinApp exe that's sitting on a share. The user executes that exe, and it just magically launches into memory. And it's just that simple. And at its core, it is just that simple. However, as you start talking scale, and a lot of the requests around, oh, I'd like to use ThinApp Streaming for a 6,000 seed view deployment, how is that going to scale? Giving them a basic answer of, oh, it'll scale just fine, is not really cutting it. So we've really had to break down that process a little better. And so this session and a number of other sessions is looking to facilitate that. So let's take a look at it. So what we've broken it down is, inside of the ThinApp streaming process, there at its core is the ThinApp payload, which is the data containing the runtime components only. On either side of that is TCP/IP overhead or communications data necessary to facilitate the ThinApp streaming process. So what we found when we used a product called Wireshark, a number of my colleagues and I started looking at actual launches using some sample applications, and we started to notice that there was some overhead on either end of the ThinApp payload, which wasn't necessarily all ThinApp's fault. It was just the basic read write capability off of the disk, and that was fascinating to us, considering that really rounds out the understanding, is that it's not just necessarily ThinApp traffic that is coming across the wire. There is this facilitation traffic, if you will, that is required to make this happen. So the basic process now is at double click of that shortcut, you have an initiation to the network share or the SAN. There's a disk read, at which point a data transfer starts. So take Firefox, for example. X amount of data comes back across the wire to the user into memory. The transfer is completed, and a disconnect from the share takes place, at which point the application launches. And first launch has sandbox creation, or second launch where the sandbox exists. There are nuances between both of those events at which the application will appear to launch faster. The generality that we talked about a lot was that the ThinApp package at first launch would launch slightly slower. Second launch would launch a little bit faster and in more of a real time, as close to native install as possible. What we're finding is that there's not really much difference from a ThinApp perspective between the two launches. It really comes down to this overhead. So we're still really trying to get down to that the nuance, but this gives you a basic idea of what we're looking at. Taking that a step further, we're looking at the ThinApp Streaming lifecycle, which is the total traffic consumed by the application during the entire runtime process of the application. This includes first launch bandwidth and subsequent launches or second launches. So again, what inside of the ThinApp Streaming lifecycle, you have a number of different launches or workloads that make up this total ThinApp Streaming lifecycle. So from a calculation perspective, we're really trying to get to the point where we can calculate what each of these ThinApp packages is going to do or require on the network to be productive or present that to the user. Which then leads to the ThinApp Streaming desktop benchmark, which is the total sum of all ThinApp Streaming workloads or ThinApp Streaming lifecycles of all software deployed to a desktop specific to ThinApp. These numbers along the left-hand side aren't real numbers. They were basic average memory utilization for these various ThinApp packages, but we just wanted to give you an example of what would be happening across a desktop footprint. So again, all of the ThinApp Streaming life cycles add up to a number, and that becomes your ThinApp Streaming desktop benchmark, which then can be given to a network admin to determine whether or not these applications are candidates for ThinApp Streaming, or should they be included in the image, or a number of other different deployment decisions. So it's really a much more appropriate, plausible approach to calculating the amount of bandwidth required by these ThinApp packages. So next steps. A colleague of mine, Mark Ewert, has created, or we've worked together to create something called the ThinApp Network Impact Study Guide. So a basic repeatable testing methodology process around core application testing results. So this document is available on the VMware Vault currently, and we're pretty excited about providing this basic testing methodology to customers and consultants. And our intention is that this methodology would then you could build on that for your internal testing. So it became very tricky for us to make these kinds of recommendations around applications we don't own. So we wanted to provide basic understanding, advanced methodology, but not necessarily make all these recommendations around what Office was going to do and what Adobe was going to do, because we don't own those applications. So we do provide some core application testing results, but again, they're just baselines. We're really looking for customers to build on that on their own. As I said, next steps, the ThinApp Repository Best Practices Guide coming soon from EMC, Nexenta, and NetApp are possible opportunities for us to work together on. So the ThinApp Administration Utility for View, which is we're still in beta. That's about to be released. One of the challenges around View is ThinApp entitlements. And so there is a challenge. Basic entitlements are not the challenge. The challenge ends up coming into play with when you try to remove or de-entitle applications from a ThinApp perspective. And oftentimes administrators have concerns when there are error messages on the ThinApp, they're the view administration console, the view administrator, and users in the pool have complained, or the application is running, or various scenarios where you get an error message on the view administrator and the entitlement will not remove. This unfortunately causes concern, and even though this isn't necessarily a ThinApp or view problem, it's more of an end user, just the nature of user environment. The perception is that ThinApp entitlements in Vue isn't working properly. Even though this isn't the case, it's just users using apps, and Vue is not able to essentially tunnel into those desktops and do anything with those locked applications. So this came into play as VMware approaches a better understanding of the PowerShell tool. There's a number of use cases outside of Vue and ThinApp where PowerShell is being used in the SRM capacity and just basic administration around vSphere and other VMware utilities or products. I again worked with my colleague Mark Ewert to determine if there was an opportunity for PowerShell to be used in a Vue and ThinApp capacity to alleviate the stress of de-entitling these applications. With some effort on Mark's part, the basic premise of what you're about to see came about. So PowerShell script methodology, talking directly to vCenter with Vue and ThinApp in the background, you now have the ability to leverage a series of PowerShell scripts and de-entitle or remove ThinApp packages from desktops or desktop pools inside of Vue. So to summarize, a PowerShell script framework that has the ability to inventory deployed ThinApp packages on Vue pools, the ability to inventory deployed ThinApp packages on Vue desktops, the ability to remove deployed ThinApp packages on Vue pools, and remove deployed ThinApp packages on Vue desktops. Our intention is to release this as a fling soon, and we're in the final phases of testing. Again, this was created by Mark Ewert from the GTS End User Computing Center of Excellence team, and stay tuned for more details on this utility that we feel is going to be a very powerful add-on for Vue to essentially reinvigorate the ability to do ThinApp entitlements on Vue. So stay tuned for more details. So now we're going to get into implementation best practices focused on a new capture and build lifecycle, new deployment strategies, and third-party deployment options. So one of the things that I deal with all the time is the basic process of what I call the capture and build lifecycle. So everybody understands that ThinApp is a very, the concept is ThinApp is very easy. It's very easy to capture. It's very easy to run. It's just easy, and it's just easy. But ThinApp becomes difficult further down the stack, and so really it can get out of hand fast. So what I wanted to do is put down some baselines so that people can understand the basic workflow or methodology of the capture and build lifecycle, as it were. So the first question I usually ask people is, where's the best place to run the ThinApp utilities? And there's many options. Obviously, I think Workstation and Fusion are our two primary considerations based on the snapshot technology. It is very easy to cycle back to a clean image to begin a new ThinApp capture. But that isn't limited to just virtual environments. There are use cases for physical desktops with the utilities running local. There is a use case, a very powerful use case for the ThinApp utilities running off of a network share. So many admins are pointing to that one share so that the ThinApp packages, the projects, are default saved to that location. So again, there's many areas of many use cases for this. So at its core, the basic ThinApp capture and build process of actually capturing the applications, a decision is obviously made where to store those projects. So the basic methodology of storing the projects led to a dev, UAT, and prod share. So as you go through the overall process, your ThinApp projects are following you or following the admin through this process and migrating across these shares as the various stages take place. So our ThinApp package, or our ThinApp project, has now gone through the basic capture and build process. It has been built and saved to the dev network share, at which point initial capture and build launch testing takes place, which is phase 3. Once that is completed by the capture and build admin, the package then moves on to the user acceptance testing cycle. And that's usually where the handoff to the customer takes place, so that they walk the package. Now, obviously, VMware can be involved, but it really comes down, this process is usually, or strike that, it's more often than not a customer-focused effort. So again, that package then leaves the dev share and then moves over to the UAT share, at which point, once it's completed the UAT testing, it then moves into the production-ready testing phase. And that production-ready testing phase is testing that we recommend right before it moves into production. So again, that logical workflow of how the packages get created helps customers to understand the basic process. It's not, yes, it is a very easy, simple technology, but for an enterprise, as ThinApp evolves into a large enterprise solution, you really need to have these processes in place to make sure that it goes smoothly. So once the production ready testing is complete, you now move on to production deployment scenarios. So deployment strategy overview, leverage existing ESD infrastructure. Again, this is critically important as you move into these large enterprises. So one misconception that I deal with all the time is customers often assume that because VMware is recommending or suggesting the use of ThinApp, that they'll have to abandon all of these existing processes. And it's quite the contrary. What I find is more often than not, ThinApp seamlessly integrates into these solutions through a number of different intriguing opportunities. Products like SCCM, Alteryx, HP Radia, and Marimba all make excellent deployment platforms that are already up and running. And so there's proven processes and scenarios and training in place for the customer. So if we were to come in and recommend some other solution, that just would backfire immediately. And the flexibility of ThinApp allows us to not have to do that. The ThinApp EXCs and MSIs, as I said, can seamlessly integrate with these platforms. On that same note, you're leveraging existing MSI tools. So ThinApp can seamlessly integrate with tools like Flexera Admin Studio or Wise Package Studio. Don't be afraid to examine customer pain around these processes. The idea of installing applications natively inside of the desktops or the OS has become very cumbersome. And the idea of supporting MSIs and revisions or user installed based apps is a new trend and a new pain point for customers. It's finally reached critical mass where it's very difficult to maintain that MSI process. So customers often have a robust MSI packaging process, but the idea of creating these install, uninstall packages for MSI has become way too cumbersome. Now, again, on that same note, I've been shocked across a number of large enterprises to learn that because of this difficult process of creating MSIs, some organizations have abandoned the idea of creating an uninstall MSI. So there's an install MSI or initial package that gets created, but because the time is too limited, they abandon the idea of creating the uninstall package. So they just install everything, and when it comes time to, they blow away systems, or they give someone a new image when it becomes too cumbersome, or they're doing manual uninstalls, which is very inefficient. So there is an opportunity for ThinApp to essentially fix that process by a much easier ability to create uninstall packages, because there's no install to begin with. You're basically just doing a glorified file copy and a glorified file delete in many cases. So again, the ability for ThinApp to seamlessly integrate into this MSI process is mission critical, and we have proven success across many organizations. A central ThinApp repository can feed multiple deployment strategies. We have proof, and we have feedback from many enterprises where a central dev, UAT, and prod ThinApp repository is feeding Citrix and feeding Vue and feeding SCCM and Alteryx and many of these deployment strategies. So really, that becomes a very efficient process in and of itself, where you're not necessarily changing how they do things, how the customer does things. You're just subtly adding on to existing process to make them more efficient, which is a very intriguing process. App link, app sync, and in-place update strategies can be integrated with existing ESD solutions. I'll show you graphically in a slide or two how that is possible. But again, using the centralized deployment, centralized ThinApp repository, ThinApp EXEs and MSIs integrated into a product like SCCM, you can create net new infrastructure that would allow these ThinApp solutions to seamlessly integrate with a remote client, a remote desktop OS. So really fascinating use case. Don't be afraid of third-party tools. Liquidware Labs, ProfileUnity, AppSense, and many more products have solid solutions to augment successful implementations. So what I hear a lot of is, well, we have SCCM, we don't want to use any more tools. Well, that's fine. And as the trusted advisor, we're not meant to push. It's just, I think sometimes customers have previous bad experiences around certain tools that cause them to, not listen to new solutions. So it's a subtle process to convince them, and oftentimes this is tied to specific pain points, like a Windows 7 application compatibility assessment. A tool like a ChangeBase is a game changer. So this is where we're back to the idea of a POC specifically for a ChangeBase or a ProfileUnity or an AppSense. So again, it's all part of the greater strategy. But again, don't be afraid to conduct a mini POC that's laser focused on a specific pain point, like a Windows 7 application compatibility assessment. Deployment strategy continued. Vue 5 and ThinApp combined make for a very powerful solution. Early feedback from our beta tests and just on-site customer engagements have been very positive around the two tools. The feedback on Vue 5 is very solid, and we're excited about that as far as a performance and stability aspect. But ThinApp combined with that is equally powerful. So again, the two have become a very tremendous valid solution for VDI. On that same note, though, don't be afraid to integrate ThinApp with existing Citrix infrastructure. Again, a lot of customers are shocked to find that VMware is willing to talk about ThinApp in that way with their Citrix infrastructure, when in all cases, ThinApp on Citrix can often be that foothold into or entry point into customers that won't talk about VMware and View and VDI. You know, they just have existing infrastructure around Citrix, and they have a relationship, and they just don't want to talk about it, and that's fine. But again, ThinApp is that way where you can still maintain that trusted advisor relationship and build a relationship where none existed. So ThinApp ends up being a foot in the door, so to speak, to get you into those accounts that are Citrix based. So again, eliminating application conflicts, alleviate context switching issues, and then centralizing on one ThinApp repository are all ways that ThinApp can essentially alleviate some of the stress of a Citrix environment. And then building upon network and storage analysis to increase performance, using ThinApp plan and design guidance. And again, don't be afraid of ThinApp streaming. You know, we're not saying that you need to push, you know, ThinApp streaming to 200,000 physical desktops. That obviously is not something that we really want to push. I mean, although possible, it's not really logical. But again, ThinApp streaming, typical used under a VDI environment. However, there are potential ways in an ESD solution to, say, use SCCM, for example, to get the packages down to the distribution points, and then have end users launch shortcuts from their desktop that reside on the distribution points. So, you know, a healthy combination of, you know, ThinApp technology and SCCM technology in a combined solution to increase efficiency. So again, lots of intriguing scenarios there. So let's look at the basic ThinApp ESD deployment process, update, and workflow. So you have a ThinApp repository. We have the SCCM management configuration centralized. And what we're looking at is individual ThinApp ESD and MSI packages that make up the core applications, and they reside off the ThinApp repository in the form of both MSIs and EXEs. You also have in-place updates in the .1, .2 capacity for the various apps. Those also sit on the ThinApp repository, along with dependencies. So you have ThinApp packages for .NET and Java and Adobe Reader, and those get integrated into the SCCM MSIs and deployed to either physical or virtual clients for that matter. And again, you're laying down those applications inside of those operating systems just as they reside on the ThinApp repository in a very efficient way. And now you're able to use in-place updates and AppLink to connect into the other program files and emulate and facilitate the same user experience that existed with the native installations. So again, a very efficient process, seamlessly integrating, not changing the basic methodology of an SCCM deployment, but yet you have you're taking advantage of the ThinApp technology. In that same capacity, basic ThinApp VDI deployment and update workflow is very similar. So again, I think it's obvious that this is, you know, intended to be View, but I wanted to keep the label off it so that people understood that it could be terminal services, it could be Citrix, it could be View. So basic VDI in general is really where we're going for. ThinApp obviously works the best with View, but it can work separately, and it can work with Citrix and other VDI solutions. So again, the same type of methodology for core applications, updates, and dependencies as ThinApp packages over EXE or MSI, fully deployed to virtual disks in the same capacity, or in this case, using ThinApp Streaming, we're able to invoke the ThinApp Streaming Lifecycle and have shortcuts inside the VM that point back to the ThinApp repository for these applications and functionality. So again, here's a quick look at the standard View installation or the View configuration footprint. So ThinApp seamlessly integrates into View, and the You have an opportunity to embed the ThinApp packages into the parent image if need be, but ultimately ThinApp Streaming plays a critical role in ThinApp deployments over the View environment. Now again, I show you this slide just to give you a quick look at, where and how ThinApp seamlessly integrates into Citrix. I did notice one thing that this often backfires on me because customers complain that this looks a lot more complicated than the View environment, and I just sort of grin and say that, well, it is what it is, and I'm trying not to talk ill of one's competitors. But again, this is a little bit more complicated than the View stack, but it is functional. So again, once you've got all your Citrix infrastructure up and running, you can integrate these into a couple of critical points. Note that the prod ThinApp repository is sharing those applications out and deploying those to Zen Desktop and Zen App, and all using ICA and HTTPS. A new option, deployment option, is a product called Liquidware Labs ProfileUnity. So this will be an example of a third-party tool that is assisting ThinApp and assisting View and just integrating with View products in general. So again, basic ProfileUnity understanding is a centralized management console. The domain controller where ProfileUnity resides, and you have a user and their persona that using ProfileUnity, their persona is then essentially wrapped and can then be brought back to a network share in the persona management capacity. Now, the dual role functionality of ProfileUnity is to absolutely deploy ThinApp packages down to users and monitor and manage that information. So again, you can deploy ThinApp packages and manage persona all from one tool, which is a very plausible use case and integration point for both VDI and physical desktops for that matter. So we are happy to have partnered with ProfileUnity in that capacity. So to summarize, you're building upon a solid design, leverage existing ESD infrastructure whenever possible, leverage existing MSI tools whenever possible. A central ThinApp repository can feed multiple deployment strategies, which is mission critical. AppLink, AppSync, and in-place update strategies can be integrated with an existing ESD solution. Don't be afraid to integrate ThinApp with existing Citrix infrastructure. Don't be afraid of third-party tools. Don't be afraid of ThinApp Streaming, and build upon network and storage analysis to increase performance. This has been the ThinApp Bootcamp implementation best practices, and I thank you for your time.